I've become something of a genealogy junkie over the last couple of years. So much so that I've broken down and I've even paid for the full-on world documentation subscription at Ancestry.com whenever I have a spare moment or I don't feel like doing the other work I'm supposed to be doing. I log on and I start filling out the branches of the family tree. Ancestry.com is fascinating as an experiment in crowdsourcing family history. I'm leeching off the work of a lot of other people who have researched a lot of the other branches of the family that I share with them, which feels like cheating on the one hand, and at the same time it's just a fascinating experiment to engage in, watching the branches extend and extend to levels I could never even imagine, watching leaves pop up on the branches that surprise me. Finding out, for example, that my family in Scotland, generations back, had Dutch surnames. Surprise, I had to call my dad with that one immediately. That was a surprise for all of us. I got into this for two reasons. First, to solve the mystery of myself, to fill in the gaps of my family history, and there are lots of gaps. My grandfather on my father's side went to his grave without talking much about his family, and so we've had a lot of holes to fill in there. And on my mother's side, my grandmother kept meticulous records of her side of the family, but of her husband, my grandfather, not much. So there's a big hole there, and that's still a big hole. I can't get much past about 2 or 3 generations. It's a little frustrating. The other reason I got into studying my family history was for a much more professional reason. I'm a student of what's called family systems theory, and I was set on this path by the fellowship committee of the Unitarian Universalists Association, who decided I had some holes in my professional resume and I needed to understand myself better as a leader in a congregation, and that this was going to help me. So off I went to these family systems workshops where you're expected to be able to track your family back generation after generation and figure out what the stories are so that you can figure out yourself and how you respond in group situations. Something about the emotional process of families and the emotional process in congregational systems matches up. And so I got into the study of genealogy to improve my ministry. There's a lot of individual formation that goes on in becoming a minister. There's a lot of focus on me as I grow into becoming a minister. As you enter seminary, you're expected to tell the story over and over again of my vocation. Talk about the ministry I want to do. It's very egocentric, this formation, which after years as a corporate drone is kind of nice for a few years to be able to talk about me. But after a while, it feels like something starts to lag. Because ministry, after all, isn't about me. Ministry doesn't happen in this little bubble of my own ego. Ministry takes place within relationships. And so I've got to find for myself somewhere in this process a better definition of what it means to be a minister. It seems wrong to talk about my ministry. It seems perhaps better to talk about the ministry as some sort of monolithic entity of which I am a part, or perhaps if we're trying to talk about it at a more personal level, we can talk about our ministry, because ministry happens within those relationships. So where do I find that connection? A few years before I came out here, I started to get involved in our denomination's work in anti-racism and anti-oppression, taking workshops at some of our national conferences. And in those workshops, I was introduced to the idea of circles of accountability. introduced the idea of beginning to think about ministry in the context of the people I was serving. Well, now here was something a little more connected to relationships. To sit down at a table with a piece of paper and to be asked the question, to whom are you accountable? And to come up with as many answers to that question as you possibly could. To whom am I accountable? To my family, sure. They're somewhat responsible for me being here today. To the people I serve in the congregation, boy, I hope so. But to the more marginalized members of a congregation as well. To the people in the community that surrounds the congregation, and to the least of these within that community. All of a sudden, I start to see ministry in the context of people who I might not normally think about on a day-to-day basis. I'm asked to bring into my consciousness people I might not normally think about all the time, to whom I am accountable. It's a great exercise to one extent, but then I start thinking about that word accountability. It doesn't quite nail the nature of the relationship that exists in ministry. It sounds transactional. Or maybe I'm entering a supervisory relationship with the people I'm accountable to. There's something in that word that doesn't quite encompass the fullness of it. As if my job as a minister were to just check in with all the various groups and make sure that I'm doing a good job and covering all my bases. And if that was my job, I probably would never get the real work of ministry done, ever. I'd be seeking that approval all the time, and you'd get bored with it too. It'd get pretty tedious as I call you every week. Janitor, you coming to church Sunday? Listen, I'm thinking about preaching a sermon about sin this week. What do you think about that? Should I go ahead and do that? And then make the rounds of those phone calls. We'd all get pretty tired of it, and I would not get any actual work done. So I'm starting to see ministry outside the bounds of just my own little ego bubble, but I'm not quite there yet. I need to get a better sense of those relationships. I need a much better question. A better question than, what am I as a minister? A better question than, who am I working with as a minister? My colleague Victoria Safford writes about Quaker teacher Douglas Steere. And Douglas tells us that the ancient question, what am I? That first question that I connect to in trying to form myself into the ministry, that question inevitably leads to a deeper one. That question is, whose am I? Because there is no identity as a minister or as a human being outside of our relationships. You cannot be a person all by yourself. To ask, whose am I, he says, is to extend the questions far beyond that little self-absorbed self, and to wonder, to whom am I accountable? Sure. But also, who needs me? Who loves me? Who do I answer to? Whose life, whose lives are inextricably bound to my own, in obvious or invisible ways? Whose am I? Whose are we?